Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, the podcast where we explore all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and in this episode I sit down with an American who found a new home in Olomouc, Moravia.
My name is David Livingstone, no relation to the famous explorer from the 19th century. So I'm an American citizen, and after graduating I came to Czechoslovakia soon after in 1990.
David, who now teaches at Palacký University in Olomouc, often hears his colleagues talk about the overbearing nature of American cancel culture. Here is what he has to say in response.
Well, the Czechs have been taking down statues every 20 years for the last 100 years, since Austria-Hungary, then the First Republic, then the Nazis, then the brief period, then the communist period, then Czechoslovakia, then Czech. So Masaryk, you've had Masaryk Street, Masaryk rising up and down 3 times, right? So the Czechs are cancel culture experts.
As someone who has lived in Czechia for over 30 years, David has also some advice for visitors who only focus on the Czech capital.
You know, I always tell foreigners, don't just visit Prague and Český Krumlov, but visit small towns, and there's many, real pretty places which are off the beaten track. So for you Prague people out there, get the heck out of there. You don't need to spend all your time there. There's much more to explore.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, the host, and today my guest is David Livingstone, an American Czech.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
I was actually born in Germany, in Frankfurt, Germany, to American parents who were kind of Christian hippies traveling around the world. So I'm an American citizen, and when I was about 9 years old, my folks moved to the States, and I grew up there in various places. We moved a lot, mostly in the state of Colorado, in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area, and then we moved to California when I was 16 years old, to Pasadena, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, where I finished high school. Then went to university in the Bay Area at UC Berkeley, and after graduating, came to Czechoslovakia soon after in 1990. I studied English and American literature at university, and so I was an English major, and I think that's the basic stuff.
What was Czechoslovakia like? I mean, you explained to me just before the interview that you didn't come to Olomouc directly, right? No. So how did you get here? Did you come through Education for Democracy? I mean, this famous kind of institution that was working here in the early 1990s?
Yeah, actually I did, but by accident. I came. I'd always been interested in Eastern European culture. I was corrected very quickly that this isn't Eastern Europe, it's Central Europe. It's about one of the only ways to offend a Czech is to call him an Eastern European. So I had some contacts in Poland and went to Poland in the summer of 1990, to Poznan actually. And on my first day there, all of my things were stolen by a Polish thief. And I decided to go back to Bavaria, where I'd worked as a gardener. And on the way back, I stopped in Prague. I was actually with a French friend who was going back home to Grenoble. And my first hour in Prague, I was drinking a beer, as one does. And some guy addressed me who was a Czech Canadian who I'd met at a youth hostel in Galway, Ireland, whose name I don't even remember, to my shame. And he asked me how I was. I told him I only had the clothes I was wearing. And so he offered me a job teaching English. And he took me to the Office of Education for Democracy, which, if those of you who don't know, was started by a Czech-Canadian businessman.
Hasek,
yeah.
Hasek, as he pronounced it himself, yeah.
Right, so they were kind of coordinating, recruiting English teachers for all around Czechoslovakia. So this friend of mine or acquaintance of mine took me to the office. They showed me a map of Czechoslovakia and they said, okay, we need you in Rožnov pod Radhoštem, which of course I could not pronounce at the time and probably still don't pronounce very well. This sounded like some skin disease, but I said, why not? And my friend Philippe, my French friend, gave me 100 crowns and bought me a one-way ticket to Rožnov.
And that's how you came to Rožnov.
That's how I came to Rožnov. I remember I was picked up at the bus stop, and the most famous English teacher was expecting me, and she was very unimpressed by the way I looked because I had long hair and a beard and no supplies, no resources whatsoever. So she was somewhat disappointed at her initial reaction.
So what happened then? I'm sorry, but I have to ask. So did they provide you? I suppose they provided you with accommodation. That was a norm at that time.
Yeah. So some of you might know that the Rožnov was the headquarters for Tesla, the electronics company. And after '89, of course, when these companies were privatized, Tesla was one of the companies which fell apart. So some of their employees, mostly their kind of middle management, were offered English classes as a way to help them, increase their qualifications. And so I was teaching employees at Tesla. But soon, since Rožnov is a small town, I became a minor celebrity, and I ended up teaching all over the place at some of the gymnasiums and language schools, which sprang up everywhere in the early '90s. Everyone was very eager to learn English. So that's how I started. I spent a year in Rožnov.
It was actually quite interesting. Not far from Rožnov is a town called Kopřivnice, where there is this company Tatra Kopřivnice, which produced lorries, and they were also suffering, from lack of customers, basically in the early 1990s. And I taught some courses there when it was taken over by an American businessman. I think his name was Greenwald, if I remember correctly, and they paid me quite well, but there was a problem at that time. I mean, officially they paid me quite well, but they didn't pay me at all. There was this kind of, nasty habits of early entrepreneurs in Czechoslovakia that they just didn't pay. Did you always, get what you were promised to get?
Well, I think my first pay was 2,500 crowns. And I remember vividly at the time there was about 50 crowns to the dollar in 1990, and the pub I went to sold beer for 2 crowns 50, so I could get 20 beers for $1. But of course, it's all relative when you're making only $100 a week. So I was always paid, not much, but I was paid. And I in Rožnov, I don't think I could spend my money because there was nothing to spend it on. So I didn't save money, but I did fine. Anyway, I spent a year there, and then I fell unhappily in love and decided to leave and went home. And I remember on the flight, my brother was living in New York City in Manhattan, and he was going to pick me up. And I said, finally I'm going to be home where I can understand the language and the culture. And the first night my brother took me to a transvestite bar. And I remember being there going, okay, I'm home, but I have no idea what to talk about with the locals there. No offense to you transvestites out there, it just was not it was a bit of a culture shock, reverse culture shock. Anyway, I came back to California eventually and kind of decided that I'd made a mistake. And so I saved some money teaching English to Asian students in the Los Angeles area, and came back in the summer of '92 and to Rožnov, and I was kind of seeing a young woman who was studying sociology here in Olomouc at Palacký University, and she brought me here. Rožnov was great, but it was a bit very small, and whatever I did seemed to become front page gossip, not front page news. So I applied for a job at the Department of Applied Linguistics, it was called. Started working there in September of '92.
And Jaroslav Peprník was still there, or was he here at the department?
Yeah, Peprník Senior, who I actually saw today, he's 97, he still goes to work every day. And he doesn't take the stairs, so I'm always afraid to take the elevator, the lift, so he won't see me. He wasn't there. He was already back here at the department. Yeah.
So then you started teaching at the Department of Applied Linguistics, and how long did you stay there? And
So I was there for a year and a half when I was called to the Rectorat, the president's office or the chancellor's office, and this is our dear colleague. We were just talking about him, who passed away. Professor Josef Jazab was the first rector of our university. A remarkable man. If you don't know his story, you can look him up. And he called me in and asked me if I'd like to teach at the English department. He was a specialist in American studies and especially literature. You'll remember Ivo Hlavizna. I think we hung out with him a couple years ago. Ivo Hlavizna was a young academic, and he had decided to leave Czech. That was still. No, this was already the Czech Republic. Yeah, this would have been '94. And so they were desperate to find someone. And although I only had a bachelor's degree from Berkeley, they were desperate. And I was a native speaker, which in those days everyone talked about. He's a native speaker. This was a big deal. So I was offered this job teaching English literature, British literature, not American literature. And I started in February '94, a long time ago, 30 years. My goodness. So I still teach British literature. I teach mainly older, medieval, and early modern or Renaissance English literature. I also have a course in British and Irish modernism. And then I do a Shakespeare course, and then folk music, and even a course in Czech culture I organize for foreign students. Because I realized a few years back that a lot of the foreign students, why not? They just party a lot and don't learn much about the place they are. So I decided to offer a course about Czech culture for visiting students. So very, very kind of basic.
do you get a lot of visiting students?
Well, there's at Polatsky on the whole, I would say, I think there's a couple thousand, like 2,000 a semester. So there's quite a few. So usually my class I have 30 each semester.
Are they from all over the place, or from some?
Yeah, mostly from the EU. So they're here as Erasmus. I guess now it's Erasmus Plus. But we also get quite a few Asian students now from China and Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Indonesia now, because we have some Indonesian studies. Some Latin Americans, some Africans, but Europeans are probably 75%.
It's really amazing, and this brings me to my next question, how the whole atmosphere, even at the university, has changed compared to, especially to the time when I was a student in the late 1980s, when we had one British lecturer whose name was actually Steve Hardy. Most of my time here, there was Steve Hardy, who was sent by the British Council, and then we had one Fulbright professor from the United States. And there was kind of one Englishman in Olomouc. And if there were foreign students, they would be from the developing countries, some from Africa, some from the Arab countries that were friendly with the Soviet Union, of course. Yeah. And that brings me to the question: how has, if you were to say to someone, try to explain, I know it's quite a complex thing, how has Czechia, former Czechoslovakia, from this part of Czechoslovakia, how has it changed?
Well, obviously, the whole world has changed in the last, 35 years, almost 35 years since I've been here. When I first came here, this may be surprising, it was a very optimistic, very short period of optimism, because people were rather naively hoping that, their life would change overnight. Václav Klaus contributed to this by promising, instant prosperity. And perhaps this is one reason why Václav Havel was sometimes unpopular, because he tried to kind of stem some of this naivete. Anyway, and of course, when my first group of students who were only a few years younger than me were avid readers on the whole, they were very keen to learn about all these books and films and cultural events that had been, censored in the past. So it was a very exciting time when I started, and students liked to party, and we had all kinds of cultural events with music and theater. So I've been organizing Christmas parties for years. We used to have about 500 students. Now we're lucky to get 100. So students nowadays, first of all, they're much more, and we know the reasons for this. This is worldwide because of technology, because of COVID. They tend to be much more introverted, shy, less social. It's the kind of students. So I would say that, this is the same thing in Czech, but that's not really specifically Czech, is it? So I think one of the sad things, I think this country, like, again, most of this part of the world, has become much more xenophobic, much more paranoid about foreigners. Of course, I was very fortunate because Americans were very popular at the time. This might change again quickly if Mr. Trump comes to power. But now Czechs are much more cosmopolitan in a good way and sometimes a bad way. Well-traveled, although a lot of my students aren't even interested in traveling. You remember, when you first had the opportunity to travel, you would do anything to do this, and we're so grateful. But nowadays, they basically are. They have so many opportunities, but they don't take advantage of it.
You're absolutely right. By the way, I mean, I discussed that with some friends who teach at other places, that Czech students are perhaps not using all the opportunities that they have, to go to Erasmus. On the other hand, I mean, my son and his friends, they are using the opportunity as much as they can.
Good.
And so I think, I mean, it's not, well, I would say it's not black and white. In a way, it is black and white, but it's kind of difficult, I suppose, to generalize. But I was just wondering, just walking around Olomouc, not just now, because right now it's really sleepy town in the middle of the summer. During the school year, during semester, I mean, it's pretty lively. And I mean, the number of students and foreign students really strikes me. For me, it's a joy, because I haven't been here or not so often. It's still kind of, the difference still strikes me. That what I see.
Yeah. So it's definitely more multicultural, but hand in hand with that goes that there's a rising xenophobia and fear of foreigners and paranoia. Which unfortunately is a quite recent phenomenon, in my opinion.
You are absolutely right. And when there was the immigrant wave in 2014, 2015, it was really sad to see, how some political parties are, very obviously using that. I mean, that kind of fear from foreigners. But again, I think it's more complex than that, because when the war in Ukraine started, now more than 2 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, I was afraid what it was going to do. I mean, the wave of immigrants and the refugees, basically, and Czechia, and that needs to be stressed again and again, per capita, Czechia is the country with more refugees than even Poland, Ukrainian refugees than Poland or Germany. And the country and the society seems to have kind of accepted that without too heavy problems. I know that there were problems. And for me, that was a bit of a surprise. Was that a pleasant surprise? Yeah. Was that a pleasant surprise to you?
Very much so, yeah. And as you probably saw, we have a Ukrainian flag in front of the building. And when I travel around the world, this is not the norm to see so many Ukrainian flags displayed as solidarity. Yeah, so we've had, as everyone knows, Ukrainians here in the past working, often doing manual labor, often beneath their qualification. But when the refugee crisis started, quite a few came to Czech. So, I started organizing classes. Yeah, sorry.
No, we will get to Ukraine again. Let me just ask you about this. On the one hand, I was really pleased how well the situation with the Ukrainian refugees was handled. On the other hand, I thought, what does it say about the Czech society? We refuse refugees if they are of different cultural, religious background, if they are Syrians, if they are Africans. But Ukrainians are okay. And I just wonder whether it reveals, racism, for lack of better word, of the Czech society.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think this is even more apparent in Poland, where there was this documentary about this exact question. I think it was called The Wall or something.
Yeah, by Agnieszka Holland, the director, who actually studied in Prague, by the way. I had the honor to interview her twice.
That's very cool. But this... when I first came, it didn't seem to be as much of an issue.
I'm just trying to get a kind of realistic and real picture of the Czech society. I mean, there's no doubt, I mean, that there is xenophobia, that there is racism. On the other hand, there's a lot of goodness as well, you know. I suppose you can say that about any society. But
I mean, on the whole, and I often tell my foreign students this the first day, it's a quite safe place. You might hear people grumbling in Czech and staring at people who look different, but there's very little violence, so I'm very happy for that. I always say one of the best Czechs are very pleasant drunks, unlike the English or Americans who kind of suppress, I think, their hatred. Czechs are naturally miserable, and so when they drink, they're often their jolly side comes out. So I think it's one reason we do have so many foreign students, not just in Olomouc, but all around the country, is because it's a fairly safe place, and foreigners feel they're not afraid of being attacked or bullied.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, the host, and today my guest is David Livingstone, an American Czech. So now back to Ukraine. You spent some time there teaching, right? Yeah. How did that happen? Where did that come from?
Yeah, about 2 years ago, I started getting concerned, trying to help the Ukrainian students who've been coming to our department and to our faculty. I started organizing courses for refugees, not only adults but kids. So we've been doing this for a couple of years now with the help of the American Embassy in Prague. So we teach Ukrainians who've arrived, most of them who arrived in 2022, right? English. There's also Czech classes, but obviously I don't do that. But then I sort of realized a while back that it's all well and good to be supporting Ukrainians coming here, but that Ukraine is going to be in big trouble in the future due to brain drain, because so many of their talented young people and as well as older people, academics and doctors and lawyers, etc., are moving west, and who knows if they're going to come back. So I met a visiting professor at our Ukrainian section of the Slavic department upstairs, who was visiting from Precarpathian University in the city of Ivano-Frankivsk, which is a medium-sized city, about 400,000, in southwest Ukraine. Okay, not about an hour and a half south of Lviv, So I volunteered to teach English online to faculty members there. And then I decided to look into going there myself in person. And I wrote, I got the name of the head of the department, of the English department, and basically invited myself. And my faculty supported me, and I went there from February to the end of April, so about 3 months in all of this year.
Just for me to get a better mental picture, was it part of Poland before the Second World War, like Lviv?
Yes.
As well, or was it Ukrainian?
Yeah. So like lots of Western Ukraine, it's seen many masters. Mm-hmm. So it was part of Austria-Hungary, then. And before that, Poland, and then again Poland, and so it's used to be very multicultural, like this country, but now it's a very nationalistic area, very proud Ukrainian speaking. So I think it was and a quite cultured place. A lot of writers come from there. I met this gentleman. Yuri Andrukovich, very prominent Ukrainian writer from Ivano-Frankivsk, who actually got a prize in Olomouc a few years back. It's a prize organized by David Voda for Central and Eastern Europe. So I got to meet him, and I'm trying to do some work on his writing.
I'm sorry about my ignorance. I haven't heard of him.
Yeah, that's okay. I only heard of him. I saw him in Ponorka. He's also a musician, so he.
Ponorka is one of the local pubs,
yes.
And that's one of the pubs that stay there, actually. It's not far from the Faculty of Arts, and that's where we used to spend a lot of time, I have to say.
Me too, yeah.
Back to Ukraine. What sort of feel does the city have now that there is war?
this is really one of the most the safest parts of the country. Maybe only safer would be the places like Užhorod, which is I also visited on my way back. Užhorod is on the Slovak border. The Zakarpatsky, which was part of Czechoslovakia briefly between the wars. So Ivano-Frankivsk, which is actually named after a writer, it was called Stanislas before, till about 50 years ago, I believe, which was named after a Polish nobleman who founded the city. Anyway, so I was teaching literature and academic writing at the university. They put me in a dorm, so that's the first time I've ever lived in a dorm in my life. And I was actually sharing my floor with mostly other university employees from Kherson, which is in eastern Ukraine and was occupied by Russia, and their university was destroyed. And so the Pre-Carpathian University in Frankivsk generously offered them a new home, temporarily, hopefully. So I got to know some of their stories. So whenever I felt sorry for myself living in a dorm room, I saw these people who living there, husband and wife and a kid, in a small dorm room, and had been there for 2.5 years. So that was very powerful and interesting to get to know some of these people. Yeah, so I would walk to work. I'd walk into town. It's quite a pleasant place. I didn't really know what to expect about the level. I would say the students were a bit lower level than I'm used to here at my department. But they were very keen to learn and very, I think they were, not only the students, but the staff were very happy on the whole to have me there. Not that I was some big celebrity, but at least someone who was willing to spend time with them, willing to share my knowledge with them, and just kind of this sense of solidarity. The first week, I think that I'd been warned that occasionally there were some air sirens. In other words, that you wouldn't actually hear anything. Right? I didn't usually hear it, but the students and the teachers all had an app which warned you when there's an air siren. And when this happened, we had to interrupt classes and evacuate the building. I guess in primary and secondary schools, the kids have to go into the basement, and they have this kind of provisional classrooms already set up, and they continue. But university students are allowed to leave, and they go to a cafe or go home or do what they want, or go to a park. Well, this was still winter, so they didn't go to a park. So that was a bit scary the first time, but then I saw the students were quite, kind of laissez-faire about it. They were used to it, which is kind of sad. Also, sometimes my colleagues would tell me that there had been so-called mining, which didn't really make sense to me, but apparently this meant that someone had called in that there were explosives, and it was a kind of like a terrorist attack, and they were never sure. Most of the time they thought this was just a hoax, but they had to be better safe than sorry, so they had to evacuate or cancel classes. So this was kind of the daily reality. Often, at least once a day, sometimes twice, your lessons would be interrupted.
So basically, it wasn't very often that you would get air sirens. And did you have to go out of the class into the shelter or something?
Yeah, no. So when we had the air sirens, we would just leave the building, or actually the teachers sometimes would just stay in their offices, and then we'd wait until the kind of warning had run out, and then we could resume. But sometimes the students would be gone by then. So I had to learn to kind of just adjust. But so that was a bit frustrating, but not that bad. I also ended up visiting a lot of local schools and cultural centers, and some of the schools I visited, I met some of the teachers whose husbands had just died in the war. So there was, although there was no actual fighting anywhere near us, the war was ever present, because almost everyone I met had some relative or friend who'd either died or been wounded, and of course there were many people who were internal refugees there, not only from Kherson, but from all around the country. So the population has grown to about 1/3, the same as in Lviv. These western cities are absorbing a lot of refugees and
internally displaced people.
Exactly.
I think is persons is the official title by the United Nations. Yeah.
And it's interesting, one of the issues that Putin uses, that the Russian speakers are persecuted, but where I was, they're very keen on speaking Ukrainian. They don't like the Russian language, although they all speak it or are able to speak it. But they're very, on the whole, tolerant of people who are Russian speakers, and because they know that these people are the ones who are actually impacted the most by the full-scale invasion, is the term they like to use, of course.
You mentioned the fact that millions of young Ukrainians are left. Basically, I actually remember from 2015, I listened to this radio documentary by the BBC World Service about the crisis in the Ukrainian society. Even then, in 2015, which was already after 2014, after the first when Russia first attacked East Ukraine, and now it's just getting worse. I mean, do you see light in the end of the tunnel for them?
Yeah, one of the strangest experiences I had a group of master's degree students. Most of my bachelor degree students were all female. I'd say like 95%. But in my master's degree class, there was about half and half. There were all these men signed up, and the first day they all showed up, and the next day only a handful. And I said, "What's the deal?" So I asked my department head, my temporary boss. He said, "Well, to be honest, we just accept them. They're trying to avoid military service, so that they sign up for university, but they're afraid of being recruited by vigilante recruiters who can just stop your car and send you off to the east." I'm not making this up. I was told by Ukrainians. So a lot of them are just laying low and hiding, basically, in their village. So there's a big issue of, on the one hand, we hear, of course, how the great progress Ukraine is making right now in invading Russia. But there's a lot of young men who do not want to go, and of course, there's a lot of now they're trying to find ways to bring back the Ukrainian men who are abroad. So there's who am I to judge? I wouldn't want to send my boys, of course, to die. So it's very difficult because they're running out of men. A lot of the men who are at the front have been there for 2.5 years and are our age. A lot of them are middle-aged, and so it's extremely tough.
Why is it important to help? Why is it important, do you think, to go there and try to help?
Well, one, I just like new experiences. I like travel. I like to be liked, to be needed. So part of me, I didn't view it as anything risky, although my wife didn't agree. So I don't see myself as very heroic at all. I had a great time, and there's no shortage of food or drink. So I had a lot of good times, and people were very hospitable and friendly. But as an honorary Czech, I don't have my Czech citizenship, even though I'm very much eligible, but I just don't feel like dealing with the paperwork. But I just see a lot of parallels between Czech history and Ukrainian history, and Czechs always, complain, or not always, but they were betrayed in the Munich Pact, 1938, and the takeover of the Sudetenland, and of course eventually the rest of the country is very similar to what's happening in Ukraine. So I think it's as a Czech and as Czechs and as Central Eastern Europeans, we have a lot to pay back, and of course we've been helped over the last 35 years very generously by the European Union and by America and other countries, and although Czechs like to complain all the time, and we have a very high standard of living compared to the rest of the world. We're in the top 20% or maybe higher. So I think it's and these people are very close to us culturally, and so I think and of course people have short memories, and if Ukraine falls, it's not going to stop.
Exactly. I mean, that's precisely as I think about it. I mean, if Russians are fighting in the east of Ukraine, that's because they cannot go on further. And if they could go further, they would go further. And the Poles know it very well, and the people in Estonia. Yeah. And it's no accident that the Poles are actually spending more than 4% of the GDP on defense. So you started talking about we have this and we were helped by the European Union and the States. So you feel yourself like Czech?
Well, yeah, I've spent the majority of my life here, and I have 3 kids and my wife. So my kids have dual citizenship, but they're much more Czech than American, whatever that means. And my whole life I've been working in education and teaching Czechs, mostly Czechs, but also some Slovaks and foreign students, this is my life and my home. Yeah, so definitely I identify much more with. I just was in the States, and being there, I often feel very out of place and experience culture shock.
And where do you go in the States?
I was visiting my parents, who are in their 80s, in Altadena, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. So I was just mostly cooking for them and hanging out, but I also spent time with friends and went up to the Bay Area and Northern California and visited my another brother. But it was mainly to spend time with my parents, I don't miss the driving culture and the distances. So I'm very happy to be in Czech, where I can take the train and the tram and walk.
So you feel more Czech than American?
I don't know if I don't like this phrase because whatever that means. I
was just going to ask you.
Yeah.
You've spent so many years with Czech students, as you just said. Is there such a thing as Czechness, or is it all bollocks, to put it mildly?
Well, I'm not a fan in general of, obviously, of nationalism, and I'm very worried about the trends, not only in the States with Mr. Trump and his ilk, but in Europe. This concept of Čechy, Čechum, and that is very similar to. There's a famous in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. It says dwarfs are for the dwarfs. Okay, it's this kind of small mentality of fear and isolationism, and this country. It's impossible to be an isolationist in this part of the world. We have too many borders, and it's historically always been international. So. What is Czechness? I don't like this idea of whatever being a Czech is. I mean, this country has changed. Some of my Czech friends often I have an experience that one of our mutual friends is like this. Czechs go to America for a year and then they start telling me everything about America. They're experts on America. But when I say something about Czechs after 35 years, I'm not entitled. So I'm often told, this political correctness in America and this cultural cancel culture is terrible, that they're taking down statues. And I say, well, the Czechs have been taking down statues every 20 years for the last 100 years, since Austria-Hungary, then the First Republic, then the Nazis, then the brief period, then the communist period, then Czechoslovakia, then Czech. So Masaryk, you've had Masaryk rising up and down 3 times, right? So the Czechs are cancel culture experts, as are the Ukrainians, by the way, and many people in this part of the country. So I think my point is that, being a Czech 100 years ago would be very different from now. I think, some countries have I think not a better continuum, but this country has never been purely Czech, whatever that even means, right?
I like to, I don't want to say remind people, but I like to mention, that the fate of Sudetenland, and that this country expelled 3 million people who had been living here for centuries. Yeah. I mean, for many, many centuries, since the Middle Ages. Yeah. And we expelled them, we sent them away. And it wasn't just a small group of people, there were 3 million of them. Yeah. And you are absolutely right. I mean, when we talk about cancelling something, this is the final cancellation culture, isn't it? Yeah. And that's what we have to live with. And do you get to travel a lot around Czechia?
Yeah, I go to a lot of conferences. My wife and I do travel. We try to go to all the different UNESCO spots, and we like to just visit small towns often and walk around and see the historical sites and enjoy the beer and wine and slivovice. And so yeah, I've seen a lot of the country. And I always tell foreigners, don't just visit Prague and Český Krumlov, but visit small towns, and there's many, real pretty places which are off the beaten track. Well, not really off the beaten track; they're very easy to get to, but just for tourists. So yeah, there's lots. So for you Prague people out there, get the heck out of there. You don't need to spend all your time there. There's much more to explore. I mentioned already. So one of the things probably I appreciate the most about this country is the public transport. You can get almost anywhere. So I haven't owned a car. I still don't own a car. Back in the States I have to drive, and that's always a challenge.
Are you going to stay here forever?
Well, I like traveling, but I think this will always be my main home. I certainly don't want to go back to the States. I think teaching at university keeps you young, being around young people. So I hope I can stick around even in retirement, maybe just teach part-time or at least come here and give some lectures and keep, visiting other places as I go on a lot of it. Now that my kids are grown up, I sign up for all the exchanges. So I've been to Cape Verde recently, to Cairo. I'm going to Armenia in a couple of weeks. So I sign up for everying. A lot of my Czech colleagues are the opposite. They're very... kind of settled and fearful. So I usually go on 3 trips overseas a semester. Sometimes take my wife, sometimes on my own. Yeah.
Says an American who made Olomouc his base, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so Olomouc is great, but it's a very sleepy place, especially now in the summer. And of course, those of you, this region, Hana, people are known for being rather slow and laid back. So sometimes it's a bit. One of the negative things I think, living here sometimes. When my kids were younger, I was worried that they'd grow up to be small-minded and kind of petty and kind of a little bit inbred. So one of the things I do miss about the United States is the multicultural aspect, which of course there are problems that come with that. But I wanted my children to have, to see the world and not just be. I think it's great to live in a small country or in a small almost smaller city. But it's also important to have experience of the world and not be afraid of the big bad world out there. You mentioned that one of the questions. So I was thinking about, what is Czechness? And I teach this course on that, and often, sometimes I realize that, many of these things are stereotypes. I just thought, one of the things I still like about Czechness is the pub culture, which I think is not is something, similar to England or Ireland, Bavaria perhaps. This is something I think which is changing a bit, but still something I think is special. Drinking beer, which of course isn't as strong as in some countries, and people have time to talk. I like Czech humor, black humor, which I think, especially as an American, sometimes we're lacking. We take ourselves too seriously and can't make fun of ourselves. On the negative side, I think, I think I've touched on this already, is this kind of sense of feeling helpless, feeling a victim, blaming everything is corrupt, and you can't change anything about the world. This is one Czech feature. Not everyone, of course, and this is changing with generations, but still I see it here, which I find disturbing and But I sometimes I realize I've become like this as well. I think what's the Czech phrase they say when you speak another language, you're a different person.
Kolika jazyky mluvíš, tolikrát si člověk.
Yeah, and I think there's some truth to that. I know when I speak English, I tend to be more positive. When I speak Czech, I usually start grunting, and in English I'll say, "How are you?" "Fine, thanks." In Czech I'll say, "Jak se máš?" "Stoj to." And so immediately I start using this very, being positive in the Czech language. It makes you stand out.
It's not cool to be positive. Yeah. And it's kind of, I would even say that it strikes me as fake when Czechs are kind of being positive in the American way. In Czech culture, Czech language, it's just not. It seems to be artificial. It's
exactly.
It still seems to be.
When they first started, these Czech companies introducing this American-style badges with like Mirek, it seemed really weird because you're going to go, "Oh, dobrý den, Mirku,"
awkward.
Yeah, because you would never do this in Czech, right? So, or even with Professor Peppernik, when I first met him, he said, "Please call me Yaroslav." And then I realized no one else my age was calling him Yaroslav, so I felt weird because I should call him Mr. Professor, you know.
Yeah, that's perhaps one thing that I think in Czechia people still have, but it's I think it's under German and Austrian influence. It's Mr. Professor, Mr. Doctor.
Titles.
Yeah, titles are still important. But I wonder, I mean, with the younger generation, my kids who are teenagers and in early 20s, maybe they don't have it so much as they don't use, you know, titles as much as we did. Well, thanks very much.
You're welcome. You're
David.
welcome.
And as I tend to say nearly always, I'm sure that we are not talking for the last time.
I hope so. Yeah, it's been too long. Next
Thank
time
you.
we'll have to drink some beer.
Yeah. And that was David Livingstone, an American Czech from Olomouc. Thank you for tuning in to Czechast. I'm Vít Pohanka, the host, and I'm not difficult to contact, either directly, if you just Google me, or indirectly via Radio Prague International. Please let me know what you think, what you like or dislike about Czechast. You can share your thoughts, for example, by emailing at english@radio.cz or by connecting with us on social media. Until next time, take care and explore more of what Czechia, its history, culture or economy has to offer.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.